So what we wanted to do just at the beginning of the afternoon session was talk you through some highlights that we're seeing in the wider APAC market. So obviously we've done a big focus on Australia and New Zealand this morning. There's a lot of synergies between, and we'll come on to that, what we see in the UK and Western Europe. They're English-speaking markets. We've gathered a lot of data from a lot of people in this room who are very grateful took part in the research. But what I thought I'd provide, and Trent would provide, is a bit of context that we've got on those specific markets. So first of all, I just wanted to talk you through some global data in terms of where APAC fits. As I mentioned this morning, at Cavell, we track telephony data in more than 190 different countries around the world. So if anyone is interested in the number of fixed line telephony users in the Bahamas, for example, and you want to sponsor a trip to go and verify my data with me, I would be more than happy to go along with you to do that. So we track more than 467 million business telephony users. Depending on what market you look at, as you would expect, the cloud penetration varies dramatically. So roughly globally, around a quarter of those users are using some sort of cloud-based PBX system, and that means something within our definitions that is publicly hosted and multi-tenant cloud. So we don't include privately installed instances in data centers as part of our public cloud numbers. So if we just take a little stroll around the world, the US, for example, I know a number of you have come from the US today, more like 60% penetrated by cloud. The UK, not far off that. Western Europe, the levels fall significantly. We also track contact center users as well. I mentioned it in our CCAS panel this morning. We track more than 15 million contact center agents globally. That is a number which I think is really interesting in terms of the potential revenue as well. And a significant proportion of those are located in APAC. And I mentioned this morning during our keynotes. I always put a ring around it as if you don't know where the geographical market is here. But 150 million, I was looking at the different regional data points that we've got. More than 150 million of those telephony users are in Asian business markets. That does depend on what you count from India and China, as you would all expect, which are really significant markets. But I know we were talking to ULAP this morning. Both Ring and Zoom have made big investments there. Microsoft have obviously an extensive business in India. So there's a really sizable opportunity in these Asian markets. What we wanted to focus on was things a bit outside of Australia and New Zealand. And Trent did an incredible amount of work with me on the research. And one of the really interesting things was this rule of 20. So I wanted to understand what you mean by the rule of 20. The rule of 20? Even better.
You sound like my mother. Yes, no, and that's not a picture I want to have right now. But anyway, yes, we talk a lot around this kind of APAC strategy. And the rule of 20 is quite an interesting thing, right? Because APAC as a region is really, there's no such thing. And I think most of the people in the room here are aware of that. You know, we have 20 different regulatory regimes. Okay, we've got 20 different cultural systems. We've got 20 different economic realities. You've got 20 different risk profiles. So trying to treat Asia Pacific as one-stop shop obviously doesn't work, right? Japan is not Malaysia. You know, Singapore is not China. Australia is not Philippines. They're all very different in all their nuances, and so the rule of 20 essentially is that it isn't just one rule solves all. You have to have multiple rules for the different type of markets and regions here. Yeah.
And I think that is something that, from a naive point of view, from my perspective, when I came over here and we did the research, we spoke to, as I said, as many providers as we could. A lot of you have taken part in our research in the past. I thought there would be more similarities between the different markets. In fact, the Southeast Asian markets remind me a lot of the European markets before the formation of the single market with the euro. So effectively, you do have all of those, as Trent said, you have all of those different cultures, you have all of those different languages, but you also lack a common currency or common regulatory framework, which makes dealing with all these markets, we heard from Dom from ULAP this morning talking about the challenges of those, and I think that's a really key thing to understand, that it is not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach across those markets. And this is something that at Cavell we're working on developing. This is the second year of running this event. Everyone in the room we'd love to hear from on future research about what you're seeing in those individual markets. So if you're not taking part in our research, we'd love to speak to you to understand what you're seeing and the nuances within those markets. But okay, so I'm now renaming that the rule of 20. That's what I'm going with for that. I wanted to give you just a few key APAC stats. So we do at Cavell get an incredible amount of data from our communication partners, and we utilize that, anonymize that, and that feeds into our data models, which comes up for our global data. So there's a few key things that I wanted to talk about. So generally, the compound annual user growth rate in APAC markets is more than 15%. So if you compare that to the mature markets that I focus on most normally, so North America, for example, we're probably seeing high single-figure user growth, if that. The UK, less than that. A lot of Western European markets, the Netherlands, for example, we're seeing really low user growth rates. The penetration is already very high. The number of net new cloud users is shrinking every time that we're seeing that market mature. So that market maturity we're seeing in APAC, it's one of the most dynamic and fast-growing markets globally. We track more than 4.2 million cloud users, so that's publicly tenant, multi-tenant, publicly hosted cloud users in Australia and New Zealand alone. If we look at a market like Japan, so notoriously, and I know we're going to hear about this later on in some of Matt's sessions, a notoriously difficult market to address, but actually the cloud growth seems to be slightly accelerating there. And so we're forecasting 3.4 million net new cloud users in Japan by 2030. In terms of CCaaS, we think penetration rates, and actually Asia is one of the biggest markets for contact center agents. A lot of outsourcing takes place in Asian markets. We think the CCaaS penetration into the overall contact center user base should exceed 30% by 2030. But in a lot of those markets, really high density population markets, you look at Indonesia, you look at the Philippines, you look at Malaysia, actually less than 10% of those users are using any sort of cloud solution for their telephony. So there's a huge opportunity for growth. And I just put on the final one there, India, the most attractive telecoms investment market globally. The amount of investment we are seeing in the Indian market is absolutely huge. Matt runs our M&A practice. There's a huge amount of interest in that market, and we've seen all of the global providers look to India. So those are just a few key stats, and if you're interested in more details on any of these markets, come and find me after the event. One of the things we did want to talk about, Trent, is we do see, you're a Kiwi, obviously, and we do see a lot of similarities between Australia, New Zealand, and the UK and the US, almost a sort of hybrid. What I've also done here is I've made the UK look disproportionately big in comparison to those other markets, just in terms of geography there, trying to pull above my station. But we highlighted some particular things that we see. All of the mobile UCaaS providers, the major global UCaaS providers, are present in Australia and New Zealand. So there's already an incredibly competitive market with cutting-edge UCaaS technology. There's incredibly high adoption. Trent, we heard consistently high adoption of Microsoft E5 licensing, really strong Operator Connect coverage, very mature channel ecosystems, and if you're interested in our channel data, as Matt was saying earlier on, we track thousands of channel providers in Australia and New Zealand, so if you want to understand what the channel is selling, whether they're selling contact center, security solutions, that's a big piece. But I think anything else that you wanted to add on the similarity? Maybe some specifics on New Zealand.
Well, I was just going to say, like, obviously we see a lot of the global providers come and use Australia and New Zealand as a springboard to get into Asia Pac, and we're probably going to talk about this very shortly. But as you can tell, that the main reason there is their similarities. We've got the language barriers of those other foreign Asia Pacific areas. So in ANZ, they feel more comfortable, right? The product, the pricing, everything can be cookie cutter, bring it down and do it here. What we'll find out very shortly is it's not so much like that. So that's a big part of what the global guys are doing.
The point Trent makes there is actually really important. I think we've seen it repeatedly from North American providers coming to the UK in order to move into Western Europe, and actually it doesn't work. And I think what we've seen is a very similar thing in Southeast Asian markets, actually using Australia and New Zealand as a springboard, as you said, with the rule of 20, it's not going to be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously in Southeast Asia, we've talked about there's a lot of different variations here. So certain things that we're seeing that are different. You've got analog systems that are still active. We've got hybrid is obviously dominant. Legacy PBXs are deeply embedded. We've also got cloud growth is pretty strong, right? But off of a fairly small base. And mobile economics are crushing fixed line. So what's happening is not gradual migration so much. We're actually seeing it as more of compression, aren't we, Patrick?
Yeah, and I think Trent makes a really good point, and we heard it in the panels earlier. a lot of the markets that you see there, the Southeast Asian markets, and it's similar in African and LATAM markets, are massively mobile dependent. So there's a real question about benefits of FMC, mobile applications, and all of the different capabilities there. Also, I think in terms of when we're talking about customer service, it's massively mobile and messaging dependent in a lot of these markets. There's a lot less voice traffic currently.
Yeah, and it kind of makes them kind of skip the stages as well, right, with that mobile kind of space, because we're not evolving in that Southeast Asia in a straight line, so it's not going from PBX to hosted, to UCaaS to AI. It actually is more about jumping from mobile first to chat first to cloud-like environments. So a big part of that mobile kind of presence is making that kind of leapfrog in this kind of industry. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see a variety of different approaches from different providers, and it does completely depend on the individual countries as well. We absolutely cannot ignore the regulatory system that we talked about today. In Western markets, it tends to be it's slightly more well documented, it's slightly more predictable. Actually, what we've heard in a lot of these markets, regulation is completely binary. You're either licensed or you're not. You're compliant or you're not. You can either sell numbers in those countries or you're not. If you're not part of those particular markets, that is a significant problem. You simply cannot sell wholesale DIDs across these borders. We've heard this repeatedly this morning, and I think that's something that definitely it was interesting for me to understand as we come into these markets. And you can't apply any EU-style harmonization across these markets because there just isn't the same level of market cooperation. And I think that regulatory piece has just come back repeatedly as incredibly important, and in some cases a barrier, but also an opportunity with some of the programs that we talked about this morning. One of the really interesting things that we wanted to focus on, that I think what are enterprise buyers focusing on in Southeast Asia? So we've got all of these things that we've talked a bit about this morning, best featured product, newest AI technology, is it global platform, is it best commercials? Actually, no, it's none of those things, it's trust. We've found the cultural demand for trust in those markets is so important. So if you're in Malaysia, if you're in the Philippines, if you want to go into Japan, the questions around where is my data, who controls the number ranges, are you licensed locally, is your AI sovereign, that is the absolutely key piece. And Trent, I think that trust piece is something that resonated from our interviews massively. We heard from providers that are operating in Southeast Asia, you have to have that local presence.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big part of it is if you haven't got a local presence, you're at least partnering with someone who is local.
Completely.
And that's a big part. They want people on the ground understanding those different nuances of those regions. So if anything happens in terms of issues, if they know there's someone that's local that's able to support them in their real time as well. Yeah.
And a couple of other things. Obviously, price. We know that a lot of these markets, particularly India and Southeast Asia, incredibly price competitive as well.
Yeah, you look at, if let's say you're going to go to Thailand, you can obviously get a mobile unlimited plan for the price of $5, Australian, which is pretty hard to compete against. Even between Australia and New Zealand, New Zealand data plans are horrible. Tell you why, I come over here, I sometimes wish I just live here just so I can get mobile data for as cheap as you guys get it over here. But the question is, why would you actually deploy, expensive concurrent SIP channels? Like, for example, in India and parts of Southeast Asia, price sensitivity is extreme, right? In some cases, and we've spoken a bit about it today, and we're going to hear a little bit more about it later, but labor is actually cheaper than automation in some of these markets. Yeah. So price sensitivity it creates quite fierce competition out there.
Yeah, and we've spoken to CCaaS providers looking to roll out solutions into India, and we've heard examples from super large enterprises who run multi-thousand user contact centers who've said, why on earth would we pay the AI premium when I can employ a contact center of 1,000 people for cheaper? So that is something that's going to be a sort of key barrier in those markets. One thing I finally, and this was a quote that we'd put on, and I think we actually heard this in a couple of keynotes this morning. Carriers across APAC are not exploring transformation, they're being forced into it. And when we did hear it this morning, that a lot of the carriers often are nationally owned, and having access to those carriers is going to be key at the moment to get into some of those markets. So their traditional model is eroding, and they are having to evolve into new models of how they do business. We heard about it in some of the sessions this morning. I think those voice margins are collapsing, data thinning, and it's a key piece of the puzzle there in terms of what we heard from the carriers. So, final conclusions from both Trent and I. As I said, we've done research here for the past couple of years. We've done enterprise research. We'd love to hear more from you, from everyone who works in these markets about what you're seeing. So please do reach out. A few of our key takeaways from the research calls that Trent and I have done and the enterprise research: APAC, incredibly fragmented, not harmonized at all. Regulation is an absolutely key factor and is going to create a ceiling. Cost sensitivity is an extreme problem, particularly if you look at a market like India. Mobile first behavior is prevalent and rising. And there is a lot of growth out there, but it's uneven and you have to be able to recognize your niche. And it's some of those things that Matt talked about earlier. It's expertise, it's product, it's price, it's those integration capabilities.
Yeah, and like we mentioned at the start, it's not about like brute force expansion. It's not about the copy and paste of what you're doing in other regions and bringing them to here. I think the real winner here in APAC isn't whoever's the loudest brand, but it's the one who's the most adaptable to the different markets. So that's one thing that I think is being the key takeaway from this. Yeah.
Brilliant. So we really appreciate all your time. As I said, we'd love to learn more about the APAC market. So if we're not talking to you in a research capacity, please do come and have a chat with me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the regions. Thank you.
Thank you.